Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Bob Cohn, the president of The Atlantic, and welcome to our Food for Thought session on Politics Daily. I hope that name sounds familiar because it's also what we call The Atlantic's afternoon newsletter devoted to everything that's happening inside the Beltway. And so if you don't subscribe, I hope you will at theatlantic.com/newsletters. A year ago, Washington Ideas took place the week of the first presidential debate, Clinton versus Trump. To say a lot has changed since then may be the understatement of the day. The story of President Trump's Washington unfolds at a frenetic pace. For those of us who spent our careers in journalism, the news cycles are just of unprecedented velocity right now. At The Atlantic, we've hired up to cover this administration, and our readers still want more. Record audiences to our website, record circulation of the magazine, both attest to the reader appetite for politics and policy today. So this afternoon, we'll try to feed that appetite and feed you some lunch along the way. From fake news and presidential tweets to healthcare, North Korea, and Russian hacking, we're here to talk about the state of politics and what's coming next as Trump's first year winds up and as we hurtle toward midterm elections next year. So before we go any further, I'd like to recognize our underwriter, Innova, for its support of Washington Ideas and for this lunch session in particular. So please welcome Todd Stottlemyre, the CEO of the Innova Center for Personalized Health.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks, Bob, and thanks to the Washington Ideas for having us here today. As you know, today's discussion will focus on the Trump administration's agenda and policy priorities. I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to focus on what I see as one of the most pressing policy discussions of our time. For several years, our federal, state, and local leaders have been grappling with the challenge of providing access to quality health care, improving clinical and health outcomes, and lowering health care costs. No doubt, these are complex and sometimes contradictory issues. They're emotional and they're politically charged. Yet it is critical that we solve them. At the Innova Center for Personalized Health, we're working to do our part, and I'd like to spend a moment sharing some of the exciting innovations we are advancing to improve health care. First, we're expanding and democratizing access to genetic testing, once available only to those who could pay top dollar. That's no longer the case. A great example of this is MediMap, a genetic test that combines pharmacology and genetics that can tell you how you will respond to certain medications. This information can guide individual decisions around medication choice and dosage to make sure the drug is effective and safe the first time. By the end of this year, we'll be offering this test at no cost to all babies born in all Innova hospitals, giving them information today that could save their lives tomorrow. It's just one of the ways that we're democratizing personalized health care for everyone, regardless of your ability to pay. If you'd like to learn more, we have a booth on the third floor at the Harmon Center, and I encourage you to stop by. In addition, Innova has stepped up and stood up an investment fund and an accelerator to fast-track innovation and decrease the amount of time it takes to go from research at the bench to the bedside where it benefits patients. We will invest in and mentor early-stage companies whose innovations improve quality of care and clinical outcomes, and very importantly, lower healthcare costs. Finally, we're investing heavily in research, collaborating with the Commonwealth of Virginia and our state's leading research universities to discover new targets for drugs, to better manage chronic conditions, and to identify biomarkers for disease. If we can predict disease, we can delay or even prevent it. Now that should be an idea that we can get all political parties to agree upon. I look forward to today's discussion, and I'd like to turn it back to Bob. Thanks.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks again to Innova for supporting Washington Ideas and this lunch. We've got an excellent panel in store for you right now. Before we begin, please silence your cell phones, but keep them handy, and participate on Twitter and Facebook if you'd like. The hashtag is Washington Ideas, one word. And we'll be taking questions from the audience as the panel gets going, so please be thinking about that and have some questions ready. So now on to our panelists. Norm Ornstein is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a regular contributor to The Atlantic and the co-author of the just-released book, One Nation Under Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported.
Just happen to have one with me.
Joining him are Atlantic contributing editor Michelle Cottle, staff writer McKay Coppins, and leading the conversation, my colleague Yoni Applebaum, who's the senior editor and Washington bureau chief of The Atlantic. Yoni.
So thank you all for joining us today. The challenge for us this afternoon is the challenge that I wake up to every morning, which is trying to find something to say about American politics in 2017. But we're actually helped out a little bit by the electoral calendar. Last night, Michelle, in your home state of Alabama, we had an election, and quite an election it was.
I noticed that one. Yes, the state managed to kind of nicely capture what is a big issue in the Republican Party more broadly, which is that the establishment went all in with everything they had, from money to the president, behind Luther Strange, and came up getting completely hammered. You know, Roy Moore, against early odds, wound up beating him and beating him soundly. So you not only have this individual falling flat on their face by Mitch McConnell and President Trump, you now have senators who are terrified they are going to be primaried, and that no matter how much support they get, they'll wind up being beaten by an insurgent who speaks more to the kind of Trumpist base. So it's not just that Alabama is at the forefront of the issues for the Republican Party. This rarely happens for us.
I'd call him a dark horse candidate, but he actually showed up at the polls on Tuesday riding a white stallion. This is a world you've been writing about for a while, McKay. What
Actually, I got a text last night from a Republican consultant who's worked on a ton of these races, and he said, Trump corralled the angry masses for himself. Other candidates, with or without his endorsement, will also corral that mob for their own needs. And I think that he's basically right. I think that there's always been, of course, both parties have populist elements, have these parts of their base that are driven more by culture war issues than maybe by other policy or ideological beliefs. But Trump activated that base in a way that no Republican has in a long, long time. And I think he showed in Alabama that he doesn't have complete control over it. Nobody does, right? He, of course, endorsed the incumbent. He didn't want Roy Moore to win, but Roy Moore, tapped into the populist sentiment that Trump did, and rode it to victory. My colleague Rosie Gray had a piece up right now at The Atlantic about how this was a defeat for Trump, but a victory for Trumpism, right? And I think that that's true. I think that going forward, there's a big question in the Republican Party about whether this is still a traditionally conservative party, whatever conservatism means, or if we are seeing an ideological evolution happening before our eyes, which could lead to a realignment, something that has been written about by my colleague here.
So we need to be blunt here. Roy Moore was twice removed from the Alabama Supreme Court for violating the law. Roy Moore said that 9/11 and Newtown were divine retribution. He has said that homosexuality ought to be made illegal, and he has spoken warmly of somebody who said that maybe gay people should be put to death. He has said that Muslims elected to Congress, Keith Ellison, should not be seated in Congress, period. So we're not just talking about a wacko here. We are talking about, I'm now at an age and a stage where Twitter becomes my catharsis. And so first I tweeted out this morning that we're talking about a nutcase homophobic racist, And then I apologized because it should have been nutcase lawless, homophobic, racist. And we have a Republican Party where Paul Ryan today said, well, he's kind of an eccentric guy. And Cory Gardner, who I will note was endorsed for election by No Labels in Colorado over Mark Udall, which helped him win because he was a member of the Problem Solver Caucus. And now he's basically talking about how wonderful it will be to have Roy Moore in the Senate. We have a party that has gone unmoored from any set of standards. This predated Donald Trump, although the embrace of Trump's birtherism and the refusal to step away from it, which I would note included at the time Speaker John Boehner saying, well, people are entitled to their own opinions about whether Obama was born in Kenya or born in the United States. I look at Ted Nugent, who when he called Barack Obama a half-breed mongrel, got almost no pushback from a party. That enabled Trump to move in, and it is, as McKay said, Trumpism. But the goal of winning has now basically superseded any set of values. And if we're not open and blunt about this, if we just use euphemisms, then it's going to get worse.
So Norm, I'm relieved that you have Twitter as an outlet for,
Yes.
for these thoughts, because you're so restrained on this in person. That the thing about Roy Moore is that he's not new to the national stage, right? So this is a guy, you can chalk up last night's election to an expression of Trumpism, a victory for Trumpism, even as it's a defeat for Trump. But Roy Moore actually also represents an older strain of the Republican Party, and in many ways a strain that stresses values that perhaps Donald Trump has not always in his personal life fully exemplified. That older strain of evangelical moralism in the South is a consistent element. So how much of this is really new?
I mean, I think what you have is, it used to be more coded, or it used to be subtler, or you would have wings of the party would do this. You would have, say, in the South Carolina primary back when John McCain and George W. Bush were running, you would have under the radar robocalls about John McCain's illegitimate black baby that they would use to stir up them. Now you can just put it all out there. Now you dress it up, you put a hat on it, you put it on your front porch, the crazy. So I do think that it is a lot more acceptable to talk about the kind of fringy beliefs or the more stone the homosexual, social conservative aspects of it than it used to be.
But this is not, this is the Alabama of the 1950s. But remember, that Alabama was a Democratic Party Alabama. And back then we had Republican heroes of civil rights. We had Everett Dirksen, we had Bill McCulloch. And now you have a very different dynamic in the parties. But I think you look at a Moore getting chosen in this fashion, and you have to say it's an Alabama that doesn't seem to have progressed very much from the time well before Michelle was born.
You know, Mitch McConnell has established a reputation as the happiest, most outgoing guy in D.C. And yesterday, he had quite a day, right? He watched as Bob Corker announced his pending retirement. Graham Cassidy, he had to pull from a vote after having promised less than 48 hours before that it would come to a floor vote. And then he went to bed relishing the prospect, I imagine, of corralling Roy Moore and every time he's got to count to 50 from now on. What does this mean for we have unified Republican government. There's a majority of Republican-nominated justices on the Supreme Court. There's a majority in the House and the Senate. The Republican president, and yet this is a party which does not seem to actually be able to muster a governing majority in Congress for its agenda. How will Roy Moore's election complicate that?
It will complicate it further, but I mean, we're already there. We already have the problem that this is the idea that Republicans control basically all of Washington and can't get anything done speaks to the fact that the Republican majority in Congress is kind of an illusion, right? The reality, it's more like a coalition government in Parliament, where you have multiple factions that are all housed under the Republican umbrella, but care about very different things and were elected by very different types of voters, and they're all willing, as Norm said, to compromise, to a certain extent, their whatever principles or beliefs they have in the interest of, or in the pursuit of partisanship, but apparently not enough to actually get major legislation passed, at least not yet. And I think that if you talk to Mitch McConnell, my guess is he did not look at the landscape, a few weeks ago and say, what we really need is more Ted Cruzes in the Senate. But that's basically what we got. He's more extreme in some ways than Ted Cruz. But you have more bomb throwers, more performers, more people who are there to take, dramatic stands in the interest of pleasing their base, and don't have a history or any experience in actually legislating or building compromise or consensus or anything like that.
Remember that Roy Moore has not been elected to the Senate yet.
That's true.
He has won a primary in a state that's overwhelmingly Republican, but we couldn't have a greater contrast. The Democratic candidate, Doug Jones, is an enormous hero. This is a man who fought against death threats to prosecute the evil people who bombed the Birmingham church and killed 4 children back in 1963. So if ever you have a contest between extreme good and something very different, it's there. And for Mitch McConnell as well, 52 Republicans, and obviously he's seeing what happens when you can't get to 50, and for most things it's getting to 60. Their hope was, with an election tilted so heavily towards Republicans, 24 Democrats up next time, to a third of those up for being Republicans, the hope that he could get a cushion, get to 55 or 56, and then get things done, even if you don't have a Susan Collins or a Lisa Murkowski or a John McCain. Now has to worry that their numbers might not increase, and there's even a small possibility that they could go down.
Can I ask Michelle this as an Alabama expert here? There is a lot of talk. There's a lot of talk on Twitter in the pundit class about whether Democrats have a shot in Alabama. From what you know about the state, is this actually a race that Democrats could win?
Let's be clear, I'm from Alabama. The family barely speaks to me anymore. This is always the question, and this is, Democrats get really excited. I mean, it's tough, and one of the questions is how much is the Republican, how much is Trump going to do for him and things like that. I mean, I think it's a hard sell. It's Alabama. I'm going to throw it out. So, I mean, anything is possible, obviously, but no matter how extreme or how wackadoo Moore comes across as, is Alabama really going to send a Democratic senator?
If you had a robust turnout from the African American population in Alabama, which is a very substantial share of the population, and if you got, at least a core of white voters appalled by all of this, it would be a different matter. But the voter suppression dynamic in Alabama has been a kind of a leader for some other states. So getting them motivated, but also, yes, cutting edge Alabama. Getting that turnout and getting them, there may be motivation there, may be a key to whether there's any chance, but you're certainly not going to lay the odds.
I wouldn't bet on it.
No.
I can put
Look, ultimately, electoral politics are a means to an end. There's a few problems facing the country. Republicans have now been in nominally in coalition government, if you will, for coming up on 9 months, and Donald Trump ran on a platform of aggressive change. After the first few months of Congressional Review Act actions and executive orders, there hasn't been all that much of it.
Right.
Is there a realistic prospect of this Congress actually doing anything by the end of the year? Will we get tax reform, actually repeal Obamacare? Will they be able to follow through on some of the things they've promised?
Oh, haven't you heard? They're going to take the tax reform and put it together with the Obamacare and the reconciliation rules, and it's going to be so much easier to do it together. Have you not heard that new plan? Just saying.
Remember that first of all, to do any of this, they have to get a new budget resolution through. The budget resolution has to conform to a set of rules, and it's complicated. They have now a tax reform proposal out there that is still a bare bones plan. It hasn't been through the Joint Committee on Taxation. They have none of the details. You're going to have an awful lot of interest stepping up and being unhappy about that. One of the elements that's in their bare bones plan, which we knew would come for a long time, we've often talked in the past about lowering the rates and broadening the base. Broadening the base means taking away deductions and credits. The really significant deductions and credits in the personal returns are the charitable deduction, the mortgage deduction, and the state and local tax deduction. The first two are sacrosanct. They want to take away the third one. But in the House, there are still significant numbers of Republicans from places like New York and New Jersey and other states that rely very heavily on that state and local tax deduction. Not states like, say, Florida, where they don't have an income tax. And we've already had some of those New York Republicans, like Peter King, saying, I can't vote for anything that has that in there. The idea of getting this done before the end of the year, when they've got something like 17 days scheduled to be in, seems fanciful to me. But there's another element of this we ought to take into account. Puerto Rico is in disastrous shape. We have a humanitarian crisis that could turn into mass deaths. A third of the people have drinking water. The administration has refused to waive the Jones Act to let ships that are not American ships go in to provide some relief, which they did, by the way, for Texas and Florida with the previous hurricanes. And Congress has said, well, maybe next week or the week after we'll do something about this. The priorities here are just bizarre, frankly. But when they do get around to it, you tell me how they're going to be able to then get a budget resolution through that meets all the requirements and then get the votes in the House and Senate before the end of December. No way.
Puerto Rico is a really interesting example of this moment in American politics. There's a messaging problem for the White House, a president who hasn't really gone out of his way to demonstrate concern, to send a message that the federal government is doing everything it can. On the flip side, waiving the Jones Act won't change anything immediately. They insist that there are barges to move the supplies in. They waived it in Houston because they needed to move fuel, which moves by tankers, and so was differently affected. FEMA and DOD are surging supplies in, and in general, the plan is for FEMA to sort of step in 3, 4, or 5 days after a disaster, after the local responders have gone first. I don't know yet what that response will look like or whether it will be adequate to the scale of the tragedy. But the disconnect between White House messaging on this and the actual functioning of the regular bureaucracy, which can go on even in the absence of presidential attention and directive, right? That there's lots of dedicated civil servants in D.C. who are going to do all they can for American citizens in distress. That disconnect speaks to the moment. I don't know, looking at this, do I look at a president who's disengaged from a crisis and not alive to its scale, or do I see a political firestorm erupting over his attacks on the NFL at a time when he should be leading the country in compassion?
Well, I think that's part of it. This is a president who, more than others, I'll be cautious here, more than other people who have occupied that office, is really governed by what catches his attention or interest at any given moment or on any given day. And I think it seems clear that from the Trump we've seen over the last 2 years that he's most invigorated and excited and animated by culture war battles that drive cable news attention and get his rally crowds chanting and those are the things that he loves. That's what got him into politics. It's what made him have so much fun during the campaign. Those are really the things he cares about. And so I think so many people were distraught by the fact that the president, regardless of what was actually happening on the ground in Puerto Rico, seemed much more interested in picking a fight with NFL players than drawing national attention to this catastrophic tragedy. But it's completely in keeping with the Trump that we've seen throughout over the last 2 years, and I think that the reality is he's never going to be. He's never going to be presidential in the way that we have come to understand it as a country. He admits that. He says, "I'm not presidential. I'm modern day presidential," whatever that means.
We're sitting up here on stage with one of Washington's last healthy surviving norms, and I know you hate it when
Teetering at the edge.
you hate it when I talk about your book.
Yes.
But one of the things in there
Here, you want me to hold that?
Makes a great holiday gift.
is a long chapter on the decay of norms, right? This is something that's happening in Washington right now, in American politics right now. And it's fueled in part by the frustration that McKay identified, this coalition of folks out there who feel that the country is not working on their behalf, who feel as if they're being left behind and left out. When I look at a Congress in comparative gridlock, at a president who seems more inclined to inflame tensions of various kinds, things that other presidents have generally tried to heal, he seems inclined to pick at the scabs of things like race. What happens to those supporters over the next year or two? Do they grow disillusioned with a president who hasn't delivered on his promise, with a Congress that hasn't been able to enact the agenda that it campaigned on? Or do those frustrations double and redouble and lead to more and more Roy Moores?
So there's no question that there's a serious tension within Republican ranks. It's no longer a battle between moderates and conservatives. It's between people who would have seen at the fringe right, who are now the mainstream, and radicals. And that is demoralizing and difficult for them. And we now, there was a story this morning, another leak from the White House, that the president internally has been mocking physically John McCain and Mitch McConnell. Remember, Mitch McConnell had polio as a child, and McCain, obviously, with his war injuries, which itself would suggest a less than united party. But what we also know is that there's a solid core of Trump people who have said repeatedly they're with him no matter what. And we know that the Republicans in Congress are basically abiding by what we could call the Trump principle. If I shot somebody in broad daylight on Fifth Avenue, nothing would happen. So we get scandal after scandal, and they basically ignore it. A lot of those people are going to be with Trump. And one of the fundamental realities that we have to consider in American politics is we are not just a tribal partisan country now, we're driven by negative partisanship. The sentiment is much more about blocking those evil people on the other side from destroying our way of life, as it is, I love my own people. And so Trump is going to have a lot of that support, because to abandon him means a victory for Nancy Pelosi and lock her up Hillary and all of these other people. That complicates matters, by the way, in a midterm election for Democrats, because normally what happens in a midterm, where they turn against the president's party, is the president's party's demoralized and depressed and doesn't turn out. They may turn out now just to block those Democrats. And Trump will have that base. And obviously his whole approach here, as the noose tightens with the Mueller investigation, is to shore up that base and get them angrier and angrier.
Who do you get them angry at? I know you've been thinking about this,
Yeah.
Michelle. Is it Colin Kaepernick? Is it Nancy Pelosi? Who's the target now that Hillary Clinton finishes her book tour?
Well, if you're talking purely big P politics, Nancy Pelosi still carries a lot of oomph in terms of a perfect boogeyman. You saw them do this in Georgia when they were trying to get the seat there. And if you talk to Republicans, if you talk to even just garden variety Republican voters, they'll tell you, we just never want her to retire. We want her there forever. But more broadly, it's the kind of resentment at the establishment, the elite, anybody who lives in a coastal city, anybody who's urban, anybody who is cosmopolitan. That's the kind of big resentment that he's fueling. He plays the us versus them very well, and I think that's kind of got a lot of targets for his people.
I think it's interesting, though, that during I covered the Trump campaign, and he obviously ran against a lot of different groups, immigrants, Muslims, all kinds of people. But his driving message, especially in the last couple months, was drain the swamp. He was running against Washington. Now he's the president. He's in Washington, and now he's running against NFL players and Berkeley students and Antifa. Right? The target is always going to shift a little bit once you go from being a genuine outsider, at least DC outsider, which Trump was, to now being the president. The the ultimate quintessential DC insider. Now he has to find other targets. And I think that
Which is good news for everyone here, I'm sure.
well, his success probably will be determined in large part by the degree to which he is able to run against those groups and keep the framing of the national debate on him versus whoever, Colin Kaepernick or Antifa or snowflake college students or whatever.
You talked earlier about a coalition politics within the Republican leadership right now. You've been talking to folks like Jeff Flake, who represent a very different strain of republicanism.
I'll be interviewing him tomorrow at the Harmon Theater.
Yeah.
Harmon,
Do you have the time offhand?
No, I don't. Just check
your
your
prep.
Yes.
How much room is there for a guy like Jeff Flake in this Republican Party, in a party led by a president who is deliberately inflaming the resentments that Flake is trying to tamp down?
It's a good question. I mean, we don't know yet. He's up for re-election next year. That might help answer that question. But even he acknowledges that this is a very different Republican Party than the one that he joined, the one that he was the banner under which he was running for Congress 15 years ago. He's planted a flag. Some people disagree about how much credit he should get for that, but he wrote a whole book criticizing Donald Trump and his cohorts. He's putting this question to the test next year. You could see it going either way. You could see if he emerges victorious in a Republican primary and then ultimately wins, it shows that ultimately all politics still is local, all politics still is based on the constituents in your state. It's very possible, the polls look terrible for him right now, they could change, but it's very possible he gets driven out and we see more and more people like Jeff Flake, who ideologically is extremely conservative, but kind of temperamentally is not a culture warrior, not a bomb thrower. You could see more and more people like that driven out of
Yeah, and you
Congress.
have the issue of Senator Bob Corker has decided
Right.
he's going to hang up his spurs. Here is a guy who's conservative and he's from the South. He is good on foreign policy, but he has had a really rough time because he has criticized the Trump administration and he has gotten hammered for it back home. And on some level, you've got Charlie Dent in the House. You've got the same, Charlie's considered one of the House moderate Republicans, and he's just, he's over it. And whether it is because of temperament or ideology or just kind of exhaustion, you're going to have the people who aren't just kind of rage-filled or fired up or who have no life but this decide this is not worth it.
I'm friends with both Corker and Flake, and I admire them both. And a lot of people on the left say, how can you say good things about Jeff Flake? Because he is way over on the right edge of the spectrum. He's a man of integrity and a good man. And Bob Corker is a problem solver. He took enormous flack from his own party when they were first dealing with Dodd-Frank. And McConnell's directive to everybody was, you're not going to cooperate with them on anything, you're going to vote against everything. And he stood up and said, we got to try and work something out here. I think the problem solvers are just frustrated because they have to defend the indefensible over and over again, and it's just not worth it anymore. Now, in the case of Flake, there's a larger reality here because we're not just talking about Trump attacking some of his own. We're talking about the tribal media army behind him. You will be attacked by Sean Hannity and by Tucker Carlson and by Rush Limbaugh and Laura Ingraham and Mark Levin and all of those and Eric Erickson and the blogs. And then you're going to have the Mercers and others come in and hit you in a primary. And if you're a Flake, where Democrats are never going to support you because you're voting for things that are anathema to them, and you have a Republican Party that sees you as a rhino. This is where we've come. Paul Ryan and Jeff Flake. Ryan being the most conservative speaker in the history of the House by far, a Republican in name only. And you're going to have to go through that hell. If people are looking at Flake and they're saying, do I want to be the next one
Right.
who loses half my own party and can never get the other side? So you're getting people who privately, I'm sure they're talking to McKay and to Michelle, as some of them do to me, who are appalled by a lot of what they see. But if you step up and just stick your head a little bit out of the foxhole,
Well,
gone.
a great example, I wrote a profile of Flake a few months ago, and one of the stories he told me was during the election last year, when Tim Kaine was announced as Hillary Clinton's running mate, he tweeted something nice. He's friends with Tim Kaine, and he tweeted something nice about him, just like a benign thing about him. And he said that his Republican colleagues were livid with him, that he would say something nice about a Democrat, especially one running with Hillary Clinton. And he actually told me that during a meeting with his colleagues, one Republican stood up and said, without any irony, if you can't say anything mean, don't say anything at all. And Flake was like, I think that moment illustrated just how far off the rails a lot of the people in my party have gone.
Yeah, and it's not ideological. I mean, Ben Sasse has taken massive abuse. Senator Sasse is incredibly conservative, but because he has been a Trump critic from the get-go, his family's taken abuse, he's taken abuse, and it has nothing to do with ideology.
So where are the green shoots? I mean, I don't want to sort of leave off here having thoroughly depressed everybody who joined us for lunch.
Have a nice day.
What are the hopeful things that you're seeing out there? And we can have a long, awkward silence now.
No, in our book, the last third is a very hopeful part, and
But he's not going to tell you anything about it because
No.
you have to buy the book.
I'll give you the teaser. I actually, having seen the movie Dunkirk a few weeks ago, which is brilliantly done by Christopher Nolan, you have the whole West on the verge of disastrous collapse. Virtually the entire British Army are close to it, sitting ducks on the beach. The response of the government and the military, inadequate, tepid, and civil society awakes and says, we could all go, and they step up and save the day. Think of Trump as potentially our Dunkirk. But it's in two ways, because it's not just what Trump himself represents. The decline of civil society, of community, some of the things that Yoni, a great historian, has written about in different iterations, that's been going on for decades. The sense of atomization that people feel, that they are not being listened to and that they're being left behind. Some of it has a racial base, some of it has an economic base, some of it's even broader. And it's the fact that in our society, the urban areas are the engines of economic growth and creativity, and the non-urban areas have been declining. The opioid crisis is only a symptom of all of that. Think about a politics where we've gone through polarization to tribalism. This could all fall apart. And it could have happened just by degree, like the frog and the pot of water, until it was too late. And I think many of us are now awakened to a reality that we better find ways to build bonds, to show empathy for others who have been through rough times or who have legitimate reasons to feel left out. And then you've got the threats to the political system and its fundamental character. We could lose our representative and small r Republican democracy as we slide towards autocracy and kleptocracy with a Trump. And we're seeing groups, including some conservative groups. You talk about Eric Cantor losing to Dave Bratt, which was a key moment. Dave Bratt's campaign manager, John Pudner, heads up a group called Take Back Our Republic, trying to reduce the role of big money in politics. There are things that people across the board care about, and if we can sustain it over a period of time and not just have people say, I made a sign, I marched, I've done my part, there's a real chance here to find something better out of all of this and restore some of our values.
This is the catch in participatory democracy, right? Somebody actually applauding a hopeful thing about American politics. It's a year of miracles. The thing about participatory democracy is that it requires participation, and this has been a long, slow decline over the last several decades. And I don't know if any of you have ever served on a local board of some kind, or maybe a condo association. Democracy is a pain in the neck. It involves dealing with all sorts of unpleasant people on a regular basis, and this is the
Now to the Q&A.
Right. But it does, right? It's really it's much easier just to let somebody else tend to it. And in a democratic system where things are functioning smoothly over time, that's the way participation will trend. People will pull back. It's easier to let somebody else run for that board or commission. It's easier not to show up at the meeting on Wednesday night and just watch the game instead. And that's the riddle of this moment. Do people turn away from this in increasing disgust and exasperation and say to hell with the system? Or do they instead decide that the system is fragile and requires their active participation and engagement and re-engage? That's one of it's a hell of an experiment to be running, right, in real time in the most powerful country on earth, but it's the experiment that we have found ourselves in 2017, and it'll be really interesting to watch the outcome. But yes, now to the Q&A, because we wouldn't be doing our jobs properly if we weren't encouraging a participatory panel in a participatory democracy. If you could just identify yourself as you.
William Hausman. My question is that none of you has addressed defense policy, and I would speculate, or have you speculate, on the impact on current politics of a possible military debacle in one of our far-flung military adventures.
Speculate about that? Sure. Well, so a lot, when you talk to people who are more expert in these areas than I am, they will point to some of the people that Trump has surrounded himself with as a buffer between him and global catastrophe. Secretary of Defense Mattis, John Kelly, who's Chief of Staff, people who have experience in defense and war and foreign policy, who are able to, they hope, steer this president who doesn't have that much experience in the right direction. I think that there's something to that, and this is one of the reasons that why I've always been an advocate of. Ever since Trump won, I've said, the best available people who can somehow get into this administration should, regardless of what the differences they have with Trump or the objections they have to some of the things that he's done or said. We need grown-ups in the room, and I think that's good. I do worry, and this is something that David Frum has written about for us at The Atlantic. I worry about the precedent that might be being set by outsourcing too much of that to military leaders and cabinet officials, right? Because ultimately, Trump is the one who was elected, and I don't love the idea long term of the military and other administration officials being able to kind of operate behind the back of the president. I think that causes a lot of potential problems for us, democratic problems long term. I don't think that directly answered your question, but that's as much as I'm willing to speculate.
I'm afraid to address, my position on presidential elections is there's only so much domestic mischief that presidents can usually realistically get up to, because Congress has a lot of say in that, whereas...
And the courts do as well.
Foreign policy, they can just cause global chaos. And for a president who likes to set his foreign policy on Twitter, I am certainly hoping that somebody has been coached on what to do if he thinks it's a good idea one night to launch something. So I like to think that Mattis or somebody else has been, thinking in these terms. It's incredibly unnerving.
I do too, but don't you worry about, obviously in this situation, and who knows, but if I like the idea of Mattis standing between him and the nuclear launch codes, right? But what about the next president or the one after that?
I don't know.
But he doesn't. The Secretary of Defense cannot countermand a president who says launch.
Well, not legally.
No, not
He
legally.
can.
Yes.
But we're beyond that at this point.
To create even more sleepless nights, the war of words that's been going on between the North Koreans and us, where now it's escalated to a point where the Koreans have said that we have declared war on them, and we've had planes flying close by. Imagine just a miscalculation, and one of our planes gets clipped or a jet gets shot down, and you have a president whose fundamental value set by Roy Cohn is if somebody attacks you in even the slightest way, you come back 10 times as hard. The possibility of triggering something that could end up with millions of South Koreans dying, and of course we have 30,000+ American troops there as well, that could escalate into something really bad, is there. And if you communicate on Twitter, and most leaders understand in the world that you don't, they take everything a president says seriously, but you don't take it literally all the time. But we have another leader who does, and it's worrisome.
The other thing to throw in there is
Yeah.
just below the senior leadership level, the bureaucracy is hollow. We don't have a functioning
Yeah.
State Department at the moment. A number of senior defense appointments have been left vacant remarkably long into an administration without even nominees. And so what you usually hope will happen is that there's constructive engagement at the sub-cabinet level that gets us out of crises before they can spiral, and that's an additional concern.
Hugh Grindstaff, could the election of Roy Moore mean less for Alabama? There's $1.5 billion investment of foreign companies in Alabama, and if he gets elected, those policies that he's promoting might run against the companies that are based there.
So you're thinking about a North Carolina backlash, like North Carolina-esque backlash, where they're, upset about the bathroom rule and suddenly they're not having playoff games, things like that?
Find Mercedes-Benz, and my policies are to treat everyone equal. And now you're electing a senator who's going to push policies that might not be able.
I mean, that's one of the most effective techniques that they, can come up with. And money talks, and in a poor state like Alabama, I would think that would be a risk for them, and that would be one of the few things that they would be worried about.
Well, let's move from North Korea to Russia. Could you comment on the role of Russia in politics? How do we square the circle? How do we deal with this?
Bob Mueller's all over that.
Yeah.
We're just waiting to hear what.
Let me make a couple of comments on that. The first is the Russian threat in 2018 and 2020 is real and big. And we know that, I just noticed this morning that the Ohio legislature has said to the local communities that they'll put up 80% of the money to change their voting machines. The problem is not voting machines, because they're not connected to the internet. And to go into every individual voting machine is impossible. But it's voter registration systems. If you hack into those and you know where to go and you change the middle initial of somebody's name, or one of the digits of the last four of the Social Security number, then when people go to vote, they're told they're not registered. And we know they did this with enormous sophistication. And believe me, there are names we have not heard yet of political consultants, maybe figures at the RNC or the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, who directed them, not just in terms of which ads and where to place them on Facebook, but which states and which precincts to check in terms of voter registration. And we do not have the money in these states to secure their voter registration systems, and no inclination in Congress to do anything about it. Mueller will get to a significant part of this. The bigger threat is not being dealt with.
I think it's always important on Russia to differentiate between what we know and what's been alleged. I don't know what Mueller knows, but we do already have evidence that Russia has been rather clever in exploiting some of the flaws within our system. All right, so just based on what is publicly acknowledged and documented, we know that we have a hostile foreign power that wishes to exploit divisions within American society, is actively propagandizing to do that, and continually probing the security of our electoral system. Those are real threats that can be addressed now, even without waiting for any further findings.
You said earlier, used the word kleptocracy, implying that the Trump administration, as bad as everybody seems to think they are, they're also thieves. I believe that's what klepto means. And that I guess you must think that Trump is there in order to line his own private pockets at the expense of the American people. Do you have the slightest bit of hard evidence that there's any such theft going on, besides him supporting things like business? He is a businessman, but where he's actually doing something he thinks is bad for the country for his own pocket.
So let's just look at the constitutional issues, the emoluments clauses, the two of them. The foreign one we know, but we also know now, for example, that we have large numbers of foreign governments who abandon contracts with other hotels to go into the Trump International Hotel and into Bedminster. We know that when he got elected as president, he doubled the initiation fee at Mar-a-Lago, and he has advertised that if people do weddings at Bedminster or Mar-a-Lago, they might get a photo opportunity with the President of the United States. We know that foreign governments like China, to ingratiate themselves with him and also to give a threat that maybe they could take it away, suddenly gave him 27 trademarks and gave some more to his daughter Ivanka. We know that his family is running his businesses, and those businesses are using the American government and the imprimatur of the president to profit. We know that from the moment he was inaugurated, the domestic emoluments clause, which says you shall accept, the president, directly stated, shall accept nothing of value from either the United States or its various states other than the salary, which can't be raised or lowered, had a lease with the General Services Administration in which he had said that he would remove himself from that business if he ever got elected to the office, and has kept it, and then tried to renegotiate the lease with the GSA to get the amounts reduced. That's a little bit of evidence. Then let's look further in the administration. We have a Treasury Secretary worth at minimum $350 million who asks for a chartered jet, a government jet, to take him for his honeymoon. And we have a Secretary of HHS who we now know spent $7,000 for a Learjet to go somewhere so he could have lunch with his son and then, figure in a 90-minute business meeting to go along with it, and has had $400,000 in chartered planes to take him to various places. I could go on for hours. To me, that meets every definition of a kleptocracy. Whatever he may do to improve business otherwise, this is enriching himself, his family, and the people around him by using the presidency, and it is not right. I know some billionaires and others who are of great wealth, and I have yet to meet one who says, I have enough.
So I wish that we had enough time here to take all the questions. We've got to let all of you go so you can get on to the next session, but I think Bob has something to say here.
Great. Thank you, Norm, Michelle, McKay, and Yoni. Thanks to Todd Stottlemyre and Innova for their support here. Hang on. So do stop by the third floor of Harmon and get your cheek swabbed, and you can get some genetic test results in the mail from Innova's exhibit. Go ahead and make your way back to Harmon. It's about 50 yards down the road. You can't miss it. We will start promptly at 2 p.m. with Walter Isaacson talking about his new book on Leonardo da Vinci. There are more forums back here this afternoon, and then the screening tonight of the Netflix film Okja. So thanks for being here very much.